He was a man who had everything money could buy. Yet inside his mansion, silence ruled louder than laughter. Victor Harrington, a 45-year-old millionaire investor, had built an empire out of control. Every number in his accounts, every contract on his desk, every clock in his house ticked according to his design. But there was one thing beyond his reach: his own daughter's smile. For months, little Clara, only 7, had wandered through the marble corridors of their estate with hollow eyes. She rarely spoke, never laughed, and often sat by herself, clutching a faded ribbon that once belonged to her late mother. The staff avoided the subject. Victor buried himself in business. To him, feelings were complications, and complications were meant to be shut out. Until the day a stranger walked through the front gates carrying nothing more than a worn suitcase and an unshakable calm. Her name was Elena Carter, a woman in her early 30s hired quietly as the new maid. The butler who escorted her barely introduced her before vanishing into the endless halls. Left alone in the towering mansion, Elena noticed something money could never hide. The air felt heavy, as if joy had been banished. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that grows from grief. She spotted Clara first at the far end of a corridor, a pale figure with long brown hair, sitting on a bench, twisting that same ribbon in her fingers. When Elena softly called her name, the girl didn't respond. She didn't even look up. Most newcomers might have forced a smile, tried to break the silence with questions. Elena did something different. She walked calmly into the vast kitchen, opened a cupboard, and pulled out flour, sugar, and eggs. With sleeves rolled up, she began speaking, not about chores or rules, but about food. "I'm about to make something delicious," she said lightly, cracking an egg against the rim of a bowl. "But I could really use a helper. Do you think you can break an egg with one hand?" The question wasn't meant to be answered right away. It was bait, soft and playful. For the first time, Clara's eyes flickered upward, curiosity slipping through the wall she had built. She didn't move yet, but her silence shifted. Elena carried on as if nothing depended on it, mixing flour, measuring sugar, humming softly. The scents and sounds filled the kitchen like faint music, and within minutes, small footsteps echoed closer. Clara appeared by the counter, hesitant but present, watching intently. That was the first crack in the fortress of sorrow surrounding the Harrington mansion. And Victor? He had no idea that while he obsessed over deals and deadlines, a quiet revolution was beginning in the very heart of his home, led not by power or wealth, but by warmth, patience, and the courage to care. Before we continue with this story, if you like the video, leave a comment. If you don't like it, hit like anyway. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring stories. The smell of sugar and butter drifted through the corridors, softening the mansion's silence in a way no amount of wealth had ever done. Clara stood on a stool beside Elena, her tiny hands gripping a wooden spoon as she stirred the bowl with utmost concentration. At first, her movements were clumsy. An eggshell slipped into the batter. A spoon tipped too far. But instead of scolding, Elena laughed warmly. "That's part of the fun," she said, fishing the shell out with a smile. For a brief moment, Clara's lips twitched. Then, as flour dusted across her shirt and Elena made a silly face about it, the impossible happened. Clara laughed, a light trembling sound, fragile yet alive. Neither of them noticed the figure standing just beyond the doorway. Victor Harrington had returned home earlier than expected that afternoon. Still in his tailored suit, briefcase in hand, he had planned to head straight for his study. But something made him pause. The sound, that faint laughter he had not heard in months, echoing from the kitchen like a ghost of the past. He stepped closer, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. What he saw rooted him to the spot. The kitchen, usually spotless, cold, more showroom than home, was a mess. Flour streaked the counters, a trail of sugar lay across the tiles, and half-cracked eggshells were stacked in a bowl. In the middle of it all stood his daughter, cheeks flushed, eyes lit with a spark he had thought lost forever. She was laughing with someone he barely knew. Victor's chest tightened. He gripped the doorway as if steadying himself, afraid the moment would vanish if he blinked. He had spent fortunes on doctors, tutors, distractions. None of them had reached Clara. Yet here she was, smiling because of a maid who had been in the house for less than a week. Elena noticed him then. She straightened slightly but didn't apologize for the mess. Instead, she placed another spoon in Clara's hand and said softly, "Your turn." Victor's eyes stayed on his daughter. He had almost forgotten what her smile looked like, how it lifted her whole face, how it reminded him of her mother. A lump rose in his throat, unexpected and sharp. Clara glanced up at him, perhaps sensing his presence. For a heartbeat, he worried the spell would break, but instead she giggled again, holding up her sticky spoon as if to show off her masterpiece. Victor swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, to demand an explanation for this sudden transformation, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was watch. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like a man in control of everything. He felt like a father, witnessing a fragile miracle unfold right before his eyes. And though he said nothing, deep inside, Victor knew this was only the beginning. The following days unfolded like quiet experiments, each one testing whether the fragile spark inside Clara could grow into something brighter. Elena didn't try to push or pry. She understood children who carried silence like armor. You could not demand their trust, only wait for them to offer it. So she created a ritual. Every afternoon at the same hour when the halls were most silent, Elena would step into the kitchen and begin preparing something simple. Sometimes it was a loaf of bread, sometimes a pot of soup, other times a tray of cookies. She never called for Clara. She simply left the door open, letting the smells drift into the empty corridors. On the first day, Clara didn't appear. Elena hummed softly as she worked, chopping carrots, sprinkling herbs, and tasting broth as if the kitchen belonged to her alone. On the second day, it was the same. Elena cooking, silence lingering. But by the third afternoon, a small shadow hovered in the doorway. Clara stood there half-hidden, clutching her ribbon. Her eyes followed every movement of Elena's hands as she sliced potatoes and stirred a simmering pot. Elena didn't turn around. She didn't even act surprised. She just continued speaking aloud as though narrating to herself. "Now the onions go in. They'll make it sweeter," she said casually, dropping the diced pieces into the bubbling broth. The girl edged closer, the faintest scrape of her shoes against the floor. When Elena finally glanced sideways, she smiled but didn't break the rhythm of her cooking. She simply slid the wooden spoon across the counter. "Would you like to stir?" Clara hesitated, her small hand hovering above the spoon. Then she took it. At first her movements were stiff, careful as if afraid of making a mistake. But Elena didn't correct her. She let her stir however she liked, adding ingredients alongside her without fuss or judgment. Something shifted that day. From then on, Clara began appearing more often. Sometimes she entered boldly, other times she slipped in quietly and watched before joining. She measured flour, sprinkled salt, even cracked eggs with fewer shells landing in the bowl each time. Elena let her take the lead when she wanted, and when Clara grew tired, she simply allowed her to sit at the counter, watching in silence. But the silence was different now, softer, comfortable. The kitchen itself seemed to change. Once a sterile, polished room designed only for presentation, it began to carry new life. The smell of fresh bread lingered in the halls. A red towel draped carelessly over the oven handle. A plate of cookies cooled by the window, half-eaten by curious little hands. Even the staff noticed. They whispered that the house felt warmer, though none could explain why. Victor noticed too. Passing by the open doorway one evening, he caught a glimpse of Clara kneeling on a chair, her face dusted with flour, laughing as Elena pretended to juggle apples. He stopped, unseen, watching the scene with a strange mix of relief and regret. Relief that his daughter was alive again in ways he hadn't thought possible. Regret that it had taken someone else to show her how. He didn't step inside, not yet. He simply lingered, listening to the clink of spoons, the soft hum of voices, and Clara's laughter, once absent, now echoing like the heart of the home he had forgotten it could be. The kitchen had become something Victor's wealth could never buy, a sanctuary of warmth, routine, and quiet healing. And for the first time in years, Clara had chosen to be there. One quiet afternoon, when the kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and warm bread, Elena decided to tidy the lower drawers that hadn't been touched in years. She pulled them open one by one, sorting through old napkins, broken measuring spoons, and stacks of yellowed recipe cards. Most of it was ordinary clutter, but then her fingers brushed something different. Soft, fragile, folded paper. She lifted it carefully. The page was crumpled at the edges, its creases worn as if folded and unfolded many times. When she opened it, her breath caught. The handwriting was uneven. Jagged letters strung together in the clumsy way only a child's hand could manage. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "I'm sorry for not eating yesterday. I promise I'll try to be good. Please don't be sad, Mom." Elena's chest tightened. The words seemed so small, yet so unbearably heavy. This wasn't just a note, it was a confession, an apology from a child trying to take responsibility for a grief she could never understand. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining Clara sitting somewhere in the house, gripping a pencil, writing to a mother who would never answer. The thought pressed like a stone against her heart. Elena folded the paper back exactly as she had found it, sliding it into the drawer with gentle hands. She knew this wasn't hers to reveal. Not yet. Some truths needed to stay hidden until the person holding them was ready to let them out. That evening, she carried the knowledge with her like a secret weight. Clara came into the kitchen while Elena was rinsing dishes, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. She didn't say much, just lingered nearby, watching the bubbles rise and pop in the sink. But to Elena, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, full of the pain Clara had buried in that folded note. Later, as night settled and the house dimmed, Clara reappeared. This time she didn't linger in the kitchen. She walked straight up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you put me to bed tonight?" The request startled Elena with its simplicity, yet she knew what it meant. Trust. A small hand reaching out in the dark. She wiped her hands quickly, nodded, and followed Clara down the corridor. Inside the little girl's room, the air smelled faintly of lavender. Clara climbed into bed, clutching her rabbit tightly. Elena tucked the blanket around her shoulders and sat in the chair by her bedside. She didn't try to tell a story or hum a song. She just stayed, steady and present. Every few minutes, Clara's eyes flickered open to check that Elena was still there. Each time she met the same calm gaze, the same quiet reassurance. Slowly her breathing softened, her small body relaxing into the mattress until sleep finally claimed her. Elena remained in the chair long after, watching the girl's face loosen from its usual tension. For the first time, Clara looked at peace, and in that moment, Elena understood. This child didn't need perfection. She didn't need grand gestures. She just needed someone who would not leave. The storm arrived suddenly, rolling in with dark clouds that swallowed the late afternoon sun. By the time the rain began slashing against the mansion's tall windows, the air was thick with electricity. Elena was wiping down the kitchen counters when the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Silence fell, broken only by the pounding of rain and the deep growl of thunder. Within moments, quick footsteps echoed in the hall. Clara appeared at the doorway, her eyes wide, her small frame trembling as she clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest. Elena understood instantly. She remembered what the butler had once whispered. Clara's mother had passed away on a stormy day. For the little girl, every crack of thunder was more than noise, it was memory. Elena crouched down, her voice calm and steady. "It's all right, Clara. The dark can't hurt us." She reached into a drawer and pulled out several battery lanterns the staff kept for emergencies. But instead of simply handing one over, she had an idea. She placed each lantern inside a glass jar from the cupboard, the light scattering softly through the glass. "See these?" she whispered. "They're jars of stars. As long as they shine, the darkness can't come close." Clara's frightened eyes lingered on the jars, curiosity slowly replacing fear. Elena lined them along the hallway floor, creating a glowing path that shimmered like starlight. Then she sat cross-legged on the floor and patted the space beside her. Clara hesitated only a moment before sitting down, close enough that their shoulders touched. The storm raged outside, wind rattling the windows, but here the little girl's world was softened by the flicker of light. Elena began humming an old tune, low and steady. After a while, she sang the words, simple, tender, a lullaby her grandmother once sang to her. Clara leaned against her arm, the tension in her shoulders slowly easing. Every time thunder cracked, Elena's voice grew just a little stronger, weaving safety into the air. Minutes stretched into an hour. Clara's lips eventually moved, mouthing fragments of the song, her voice too quiet to carry, but enough to show she was no longer afraid. Her head tilted, resting fully against Elena's chest, her eyes half closed as the glow of the jars of stars painted her face in soft gold. By the time the storm reached its peak, Clara was asleep, her breathing slow and even. The front door opened then, a burst of cold air and rain sweeping inside. Victor Harrington stepped in, drenched from head to toe, his coat plastered to his frame. He paused when he saw the faint light spilling from the hall. He followed it and stopped dead. There on the floor, Elena sat with Clara asleep in her arms, surrounded by glowing jars. The little girl's face was peaceful, untouched by fear, as if the storm outside belonged to another world. Victor's throat tightened. He crouched down beside them, watching the rise and fall of his daughter's chest. For all his wealth, he had never been able to give her this. Comfort, presence, a sense of safety in the dark. As the thunder rolled, he realized the truth. Protection wasn't enough. Clara didn't just need safety. She needed someone who would sit with her through the storm. And that night, it wasn't him. It was Elena. The storm passed, but something lingered in the air of the Harrington mansion. The silence was softer now, no longer oppressive, but waiting, like soil before new growth. It was Clara who first broke that silence, though in her own quiet way. One late morning, while she sat in the kitchen sketching with crayons, she spoke without lifting her eyes. "Mom used to take care of the flowers, in the glass room." Her words hung fragile between them. Elena didn't press. She simply nodded, her hands steady as she sliced fruit. The conversation ended there, but the seed had been planted. Days later, Clara appeared again, this time in the hallway, holding her stuffed rabbit like a guide. "Do you want to see it?" she asked. Her voice was soft, yet there was an unusual determination behind it. Elena smiled gently. "Of course." Clara led her down a back corridor to a pair of heavy glass doors clouded with dust. She pushed them open with effort, and a long-forgotten space revealed itself. The winter garden. Once it must have been beautiful. Now it looked like a graveyard of plants. Leaves hung brown and brittle, soil cracked with neglect. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decay. Yet patches of sunlight slipped through the tall windows, illuminating stubborn shoots of green that clung to life against the odds. Clara walked among the rows with careful steps, pausing at certain pots. "These were her favorites," she whispered, tracing a finger along a cracked ceramic planter. She didn't look sad so much as thoughtful, carrying memories too heavy for her age. Elena said little. She didn't turn the moment into a lesson or a conversation about loss. Instead, she crouched beside the pots, brushing dust from the rim, letting Clara lead. Over the following weeks, the winter garden became their sanctuary. They visited whenever Clara wished, sometimes bringing a watering can, other times a packet of seeds Elena had discovered in the pantry. Together they knelt in the dirt, wiping leaves clean, trimming what could be saved. Clara gave instructions in her small, serious voice, where the roses had once grown, how the lilies used to stand tall. Elena followed as though every word were law. Slowly the room began to change. The smell of fresh soil replaced the staleness. Tiny sprouts pushed through the earth. Clara's footsteps grew more confident, her cheeks brighter as she moved from pot to pot. What had been a shrine of grief was becoming something else, a place to nurture, not mourn. One afternoon, Victor returned home earlier than usual. Passing through the back hall, he noticed the doors ajar. Curious, he stepped closer and froze. Inside, sunlight spilled across Elena and Clara as they worked side by side. Clara was watering a small sprout with reverent care, her lips curved in concentration. Elena, her hands streaked with soil, pressed fresh earth around a stem. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet rhythm of their work was enough. Victor's breath caught. He remembered standing in this room years ago with his wife, her laughter filling the space as she tended every plant. Now, for the first time in years, the garden looked alive again, and so did his daughter. Victor stepped inside, but he didn't interrupt. He simply stood among the sunlight and soil, realizing that what was growing here was more than plants. It was the slow, steady return of hope. The winter garden had begun to bloom again, and with it, Clara herself seemed to awaken. She laughed more, spoke more, and even teased Elena lightly when flour dusted across her nose during baking. But one morning, something happened that went beyond laughter. Elena was polishing the kitchen counter when Clara appeared in the doorway, holding an envelope with both hands. She looked hesitant, as though the paper might be too heavy to carry. "Is that for me?" Elena asked gently, crouching to eye level. Clara shook her head. Her voice was quiet but firm. "It's for Mom." Elena's heart ached at the words, but she didn't press. She simply extended her hand. "Do you want me to see it?" Clara nodded. With care, Elena opened the envelope. Inside was a drawing, the kind only a child could make. Bright crayon colors, uneven lines, but filled with meaning. 4 figures stood side by side, Clara, Elena, and Victor, with a woman floating just above them, surrounded by small blue clouds and a shining yellow sun. Everyone was smiling. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, Clara had written, "We are okay now. She helped." For a moment, Elena couldn't breathe. She glanced at Clara, who watched her anxiously. Elena forced a steady smile. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and she meant it. Clara fidgeted with the hem of her dress. "Can we show Dad?" Elena folded the paper carefully back into the envelope. "Of course." Together, they walked down the long corridor toward Victor's study. Elena knocked softly. His deep voice called from inside. When they entered, he was bent over a stack of contracts, his pen scratching across the page. But the moment he saw them, he paused. Elena stepped forward. "Clara made this," she said simply, handing him the envelope. Victor opened it, his brow furrowing in curiosity. Then his eyes landed on the drawing. For a long time, he said nothing. His gaze traced the smiling figures. The sun, the mother in the sky. His hand froze halfway, pressing the page flat on his desk. And then he saw the words. "We are okay now. She helped." His breath caught. His throat tightened. The edges of his vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. Tears he hadn't allowed himself in years. He blinked quickly, but they spilled anyway, streaking down his face. Clara stepped forward, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "It's true, Daddy," she whispered into his chest. Victor let out a shaky breath, one hand clutching the drawing while the other rested on his daughter's back. He didn't try to stop the tears. For once, he didn't care who saw. When he finally lifted his eyes, they met Elena's. His gaze was raw, unguarded. In it was something more powerful than words. Recognition. Gratitude. Without speaking, he extended his free hand toward her. Elena stepped closer, taking it briefly, her fingers giving a quiet squeeze. There was no need for speeches. The message was already written, in crayons in a child's hand, and in the tears of a man who had finally understood. For Victor, it was the proof he had been waiting for. His daughter was healing, and he wasn't doing it alone. The backyard, once a manicured showpiece meant only for garden parties, had become something different. On warm afternoons, Clara darted across the grass with a ball clutched in her hands, her laughter echoing like sunlight. Elena often joined her, playing simple games, chasing and tumbling, while Victor usually watched from the sidelines, hands in his pockets, the image of a man still unsure how to step into joy. But that day something shifted. Victor had come home early, tie loosened, jacket gone, and Clara wasted no time. "Daddy, come play," she shouted, her cheeks pink from running. For a moment, he hesitated. Businessmen like Victor didn't run across damp lawns. But when Clara tugged his hand, he gave in. He rolled up his sleeves, took his position, and before long, the three of them were weaving across the grass, passing the ball, tripping over laughter, inventing rules that made no sense but mattered to no one. It was chaos, pure and alive. At one point, Clara hurled the ball toward Elena. She caught it and spun, ready to toss it back. But Victor darted forward to intercept. His shoes slid on the damp grass. In the same instant, Elena moved to steady him. Instead of balance, momentum pulled them both down. They crashed to the ground, tangled in laughter, the earth damp beneath them. Clara's squeal of delight rang from a few feet away. For a heartbeat, Elena and Victor stayed where they'd fallen, her shoulder pressed against his chest, his hand gripping her arm. Their laughter faded, leaving only the quick rhythm of breath. Victor's eyes met hers. Closer than they had ever been, the barrier between employer and maid thinner than a whisper. Then it happened. Almost unthinking, he leaned in, and Elena didn't move away. Their lips touched, brief, fleeting, but real. The world seemed to pause. When they pulled back, the silence was louder than Clara's giggles. Victor's expression shifted, the softness replaced by something harder. He stood quickly, brushing grass from his shirt. "That was a mistake," he said firmly. His tone wasn't angry, but final, a line drawn in the dirt. Elena rose more slowly, her face neutral though her heart raced. She said nothing. She knew the words were meant to protect Clara from confusion, but that didn't erase the truth. The kiss had happened. Clara, still playing with the ball, hadn't noticed. She ran back, tugging at Victor's sleeve, demanding another round. He forced a smile, picking up the game as if nothing had changed. Elena joined in too, but the air between them carried a new tension, something fragile, undeniable, and left unspoken. From that moment forward, the backyard was no longer just a place for games. It was a reminder that some lines once crossed could never be unseen, even if both pretended otherwise. And both of them knew nothing would be the same again. It began with a disagreement so quiet it hardly seemed like an argument at first. Victor sat at the dining table with Clara's schoolwork spread out neatly before him. His voice was calm, measured, but firm. "She needs structure, discipline. If we don't set boundaries, she'll grow up fragile." Elena, standing by the doorway, shook her head. "She doesn't need stricter rules, Victor. She needs space to feel safe. She's already lived through more than any child should." The words collided softly but sharply, neither willing to bend. Clara, coloring quietly in the living room, listened in silence. No one noticed when the soft scrape of her chair broke the air, or when she slipped away. By the time the house grew still again, she was gone. "Elena?" Victor's voice was suddenly uneasy as he glanced into the empty living room. The coloring book lay open on the table, crayons scattered like dropped clues. Panic flickered in his chest. They searched quickly, hallways, kitchen, backyard, but the house seemed too large, the silence too heavy. Elena's mind raced until a memory surfaced. Clara once mentioned the glass house, an old greenhouse at the far edge of the estate. Without hesitation, Elena grabbed a sweater and hurried into the evening air, Victor close behind. Gravel crunched under their shoes as they crossed the dimming garden. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its glass panels clouded with age. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with earth and neglect. And then they saw her. Clara sat in the far corner, knees drawn tight, clutching her stuffed rabbit as though it were the only thing holding her together. Elena crouched down, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Clara," she said softly, "why did you run?" The girl's eyes shimmered, wide and frightened. "I thought you were going to leave, just like Mommy did." The words cut deeper than any thunderclap. Elena reached out, her hand open and still. "I'm not leaving. I'm here because I want to be, not because anyone told me to, and I'll stay." For a moment, Clara stared, testing the promise in her eyes. Then slowly, she placed her small hand into Elena's palm. Victor stepped closer, kneeling beside them. His voice, usually so controlled, was low and rough. "Clara, I'm sorry. We didn't mean to make you feel that way. No one is sending Elena away. She's part of this, part of us." The girl looked between them, searching for truth. When she saw both faces steady and sure, her shoulders finally eased. She leaned into Elena, clutching her tightly. Victor met Elena's gaze across the small space. It wasn't an apology for the argument. It was recognition of the bond she had built, the bond he himself had nearly broken. Together they rose and walked back through the fading light, Clara's hand clasped firmly in Elena's. She didn't let go until they were safe inside again. And for the first time, Victor admitted silently what he had resisted all along. This wasn't just an arrangement. This was a family being born in real time, fragile but unshakable. The decision had been eating at her for days. Elena sat at the kitchen table before dawn, 2 letters folded neatly in front of her. One for Clara, filled with words of gratitude, encouragement, and a promise that she was braver than she knew. The other for Victor, short, formal, explaining that leaving was best for everyone. By sunrise, her bag was packed. She walked through the mansion quietly, the house still asleep. Passing the kitchen, her eyes lingered on the crayon drawing pinned to the fridge. Clara's picture of 4 smiling figures under the sun, the words, "We are okay now." She helped. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself forward. At the gate, rain drizzled against her umbrella. She set her bag down, slid the key into the lock, only to hear her name shouted through the storm. "Elena!" She turned. Clara was running across the gravel, soaked, holding a piece of cardboard above her head. Victor followed close behind, rain plastering his shirt to his frame. When Clara reached her, she turned the cardboard forward. In large, uneven letters, it read, "Please stay." The words were messy, hurried, the ink bleeding in the rain, but their meaning was as clear as the child's wide, pleading eyes. Elena froze. Her reasons for leaving, professional boundaries, unspoken fears, suddenly felt fragile. Clara clutched her hand, whispering through tears, "You said you wouldn't leave." Victor caught his breath beside them. His voice was steady, low, but certain. "We don't need perfect. We just need you." The storm blurred everything, but Elena could see them clearly. Clara's desperate hope, Victor's raw honesty, and in that moment she understood. Walking away wasn't protecting anyone. It was abandoning the family they had built. Her umbrella slipped from her hand. Kneeling, she pulled Clara into her arms. "Okay," she whispered through the rain. "I'll stay." Relief washed over Clara's face as she clung tighter. Victor exhaled, a sound more like release than breath. Without another word, he picked up Elena's bag, slinging it over his shoulder as if it had never been meant to leave. They walked back together, Victor, Elena, and Clara, through the storm, steps lighter than the rain around them. Months later, the house no longer echoed with emptiness. The kitchen had become its heart, the winter garden its soul. One afternoon, Clara insisted on taking a photo. The 3 of them stood close, shoulders touching, as the camera clicked. When Clara asked, "What are we now?" Victor didn't hesitate. "We're a family." It wasn't the kind of family he had once imagined, polished, perfect, untouched by pain. It was something stronger, chosen, tested, and bound by presence. Because family is never just about blood. It's about choosing to stay, even when it's hard. And if this story touched your heart, remember, if you like the video, leave a comment. If you don't like it, hit like anyway. Subscribe to our channel and stay with us, because the next story might be the one that changes the way you see family forever.